Hi learners, welcome back to this course on Sociology of Media and Communication. Today I am back with lecture number 27 and we are going to start the fourth unit, which is titled Media Processes, Identities, Formations and Representations. In this unit, the intention is to understand how the media plays a role in creating identities based on social causes and reflections, as well as how the media represents particular social identities, especially those of the marginalized sections. We will also talk about the process that goes into the making of the content on media, as well as formations of particular ideas of what is considered to be content. So, to begin this unit, we are going to start with a book by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky, which is titled Manufacturing Consent, the Propaganda Model. It was written in 1988, particularly keeping in mind the US context. Now, this book has assumed cult status, and many of you would be familiar with Chomsky as a thinker who is also credited with thinking about structural changes in terms of how media manipulates what is considered news. So, I am going to draw from this book and talk about the propaganda model, in how primarily a model which is called the propaganda is created, and it is used as an analytical framework that explains the performance of the US media in terms of the basic institutional structures and relationships within which they operate. So, this propaganda model that Herman and Chomsky talk about is used as an analytical framework. You can also call it a conceptual framework, and this particularly makes an attempt to understand the US media in the American context in terms of the basic institutional structures, number one, and then the relationships within which they operate. Among their other functions, the media serve and also propagandize on behalf of the powerful social interest or the societal interests that control and finance them. So, we will go on to see how there is a nexus between business and politics, and this is something that Chomsky talks about, that you observe that there is a kind of intertwining of the two. The representatives of these interests have important agendas. These agendas are very crucial, and principles that they want to advance, and they are well positioned to shape and constrain media policy. How those interests, who may have huge businesses, but also political interest, how they buy channels and then invest in them, and then they are able to shape and constrain media policy, is a part of what the propaganda model studies. This is normally not accomplished by only crude intervention. Brute force is not the answer, but by the selection of right thinking personnel, and also by the editors and working journalists who internalize the priorities. What is required is ideological kind of maneuvering. So, ideology is important, and therefore, only brute force is not the solution, and definitions of how something is defined and considered to be newsworthy, which conform to the institution's policy. So, what one has actually is a model which is called the propaganda model, because it has an ideological basis in terms of how what media considers to be content and news is created. So, therefore, more than brute force, what is important is this kind of ideological power, primarily because it is manifested in the way that media operates at an everyday level. So, what we are interested in is looking at how this model is created. And now, let us talk first about the structural factors, which are primarily related to the ownership and control, dependence on other major funding sources, primarily advertisers, and we will also go on to talk about how the entry of advertising into media has changed its nature, and the mutual interest and relationships between the media and those who make the news and have the power to define it and explain what it means. So, these are some of the structural factors that make the propaganda model but it also incorporates other closely related factors, such as the ability to complain about the media's treatment of news, which is producing flack, and we will talk more about it, to provide experts to confirm the official slant on the news. Expertise is also used to create the propaganda model and spread its message amongst masses, and to fix the basic principles and ideologies that are taken for granted by the media personnel and the elite, but are often resisted by the general population. The same underlying power sources that basically own the media and fund them as advertisers serve as primary definers of the news. So, what is news, how we think about news, it is basically defined by powerful interest and sources, and then that produce the flack and the expertise. They play a key role in basically fixing the basic principles and then determining the dominant ideologies. What one sees is that media, when we think of its democratic nature, is actually very curated as well, which is why the book is titled Manufacturing Consent. How is consent manufactured like a product or a good? Now, the propaganda model explains the broad sweep of the mainstream media's behavior and performance by basically focusing on its corporate character and then integrating it into the political economy of the dominant economic system. So, there is a focus on the corporatization of media, primarily through entry of advertisement, growth of media houses, media schools, etc. The focus is on the rise in scale of media enterprise, as exhibited by how media has become an industry, the media's gradual concentration and centralization, the growth of media conglomerates like the media houses that control many different kinds of media. They own motion picture studios, TV networks, cable channels, magazines and book publishing houses, and then the spread of the media across borders in a globalization process. What you also have, let's say, a conglomerate basically running different kinds of TV news channels. It may run a Hindi news channel, an English news channel. It sometimes may run 2 English news channels or 2 Hindi news channels, and very interestingly, one will cater to a particular kind of audience, whereas the other will cater to a different kind of audience. So, for them, ideology is mostly about profit, which is the primary motive of industrialization, because you may observe that one channel run by the same conglomerate may have a very particular ideology, and in comparison another channel has a different one, but they both are run by the same media conglomerate and goes on to talk about the corporatization. It also talks about the concentration of media, because today media is not anymore about the small kind of newspapers, magazines, etc. It is only in the digital media where you have presence of alternative media, and therefore in the third unit we went on to discuss about why the digital sphere goes on to become very crucial for democracy, ideological dissemination, etc., as well as giving voices to the margins and alternatives, because mainstream media has primarily also become very centralized and corporatized. Now, the propaganda model explains how media, power and money filter news. So, we will in the later part of the unit go on to talk about how news and what is considered to be news is curated through the ideas of power and also money. And this is basically what the propaganda model explains. Mass media mobilizes support for dominant elite interest, and this is again something which happens at an ideological level. So, to ask for support for your ideas and interests without mass support does not work in a democratic setup, and therefore, the media's role is very important. For instance, if one looks at, let's say, Netflix series and different kinds of reportage on criminals, you may find that some criminals are portrayed in a very different way compared to another group. So, in the Western context, if the criminal belongs to an African American community, he would, or she or they would be represented as an evil person who has a criminal intent. Whereas, when it is a person belonging to a white racial background, there is an angle of sympathy attached to how the case is reported. There could be a focus on their mental health issues or how they have been struggling, etc. And what is observed is that media creates a kind of sympathy for a particular identity. Similarly, when there could be reportage of cases of sexual harassment and assault, in many cases the rapist or the assaulter could be depicted in sympathetic and empathetic terms, which creates a mass media propaganda that this person, is not as bad as it seems. There is also an element of sensationalization in it, precisely because the story is sensationalized, where the focus is not on a linear kind of perspective that it is a criminal and they only deserve to be punished, but instead the story is humanized, it is curated by the media. Many parts of the world today see media trials where people are asked to give opinions on particular issues in terms of what they feel, how it should pan out, etc. And again one sees that media sort of mobilizes support for what they would see as, the right thing to do. So, media also works through a selection of topics and how those topics are framed, the emphasis and the omission. For long in the Indian context, regions like Northeast India have not been adequately covered, and there have been silences and ignorances in coverage of these regions. In fact, for many, even when they are flood affected, particularly in the monsoon season, they do not get that kind of adequate coverage. Again, the reason is that the media does not consider it to be newsworthy and profit oriented. So, this propaganda model as an analytical framework developed by Herman and Chomsky explains the inner workings of the media. So, what we see on the outer side is explained by an understanding of its inner areas. The core argument that is developed is that media itself operates within structural constraints, and therefore, many of the loopholes that we find in how media presents stories are evidently understood within those structural constraints. These constraints in fact act as filters, and Chomsky and Herman go on to develop these filters, which we will discuss in detail in a little while. And the news actually passes from one filter to another before it reaches the public. So, this filtration is also about curating the news that it becomes a product. So, what we are focusing on is that the news should become a product, otherwise it is not newsworthy. So, anything and everything does not become a news, it has to have some sort of worthiness to be qualified as a product. So, at the end of the day, what we are also doing is making and understanding how news itself is a commodity. So, let us first focus on the first filter, which is size, ownership, profit orientation of mass media. Now, in the first filter, Chomsky and Herman goes on to trace how dominant media operate through large corporations, which are primarily owned by wealthy individuals or conglomerates. So, this is also a very recent phenomena which has been observed in developed as well as developing countries, that media houses are owned by politically influential individuals or very wealthy individuals and collectives, and therefore, the motive behind opening a media house is not generally to disseminate knowledge and information, but profit. So, the profit motive shapes the news priorities, and this is also something which has been talked about by people who have looked at the structural transformation of the public sphere. Essentially from basically mass media's role as an active participant in disseminating knowledge, creating citizens who are knowledgeable, to something which is consumerist and mediated through entertainment possibilities. Now, this kind of an understanding of media also makes us understand why content which threatens elite interest is avoided and not covered adequately. So, Chomsky and Herman's idea of the first filter is concentrated basically on how the size of the media is influenced by its ownership and then its profit orientation. This model, although developed in the American context, has applicability outside that particular geographical context as well, where you can see how media in several countries including India has these filters, and it operates within those structural constraints. I am taken back to this film called Fir Bhi Dil Hai Hindustani, which is an old 90s film, where the film was centered around two journalists or two news personnel, Shah Rukh Khan's character and Juhi Chawla's character, who basically worked for rival channels, and therefore there was always a rivalry to get the first news, to get the best news. You could see that news was a commodity which you had to get and present to the people. However, as luck would have it, and as the plot of the film unfolds, both of them come together because they realize that there was a story which needed to be aired, and that should not be governed by the profit motive. It was about a man who was framed mistakenly and wrongly for a crime that he had not committed. Interestingly, when both of them take the story to their owners who own the media houses, they refuse to air it, very well illustrating how the media house owners had other complicit hidden interests, because they were politically compromised, and this was a political a case in which this person was framed by the ruling party. Therefore, the media house owners refused to air the news, although it was what they would call a breaking news and a very hot piece of news. The film highlights the way that the media operates, primarily through that political nexus and this complicitness that exists between profit and political motives. It's a very old film of the 1990s. I don't exactly remember the date, but again, it was a telling commentary on how one could understand how propaganda is created. I will then go on to talk about the second filter, advertising. And advertising actually has been on the rise, and media consistently today depends on advertising revenue. Many of you who are familiar with newspapers, if you open the newspaper, you will notice that political campaigns, political advertisements dominate the first page. And this is again something which has contributed to how the media has become compromised in most contexts, precisely because of the revenue generation through advertising. Advertisers influence the visibility of the content that goes into media, primarily because they are the ones who are funding and financing media houses, newspaper and publishing content, etc. And therefore, the neutrality and the objectivity of the media is questioned. What you also see is that content which is critical, content which is thought oriented, it gets marginalized. We had a discussion when we were talking about the Indian public sphere on how both English and vernacular media adapted to changing global lifestyles and identities by bringing in content which was more entertainment oriented, like let's say fashion content, lifestyle content, etc. And what it indicated was again what Habermas and others, particularly people who looked at the public sphere, would argue that there is a consumerization of media itself, that how the public sphere is now being created. So, advertisement and the role that advertisers play, it has had a negative kind of impact on how we should think then about the media. The third filter is sourcing. Now, this is also very important, that the media rely on government and corporate sources for their information. So, what it means is the sources itself also have political and ideological kind of nexuses and leanings. These sources are seen as credible, which provide regular and authentic information, and this means that the dependence reduces the critical distance from the political corporate kind of sources. So, if you are dependent on your information on someone, can there be criticality when you have to criticize those sources? This is a very important question that we should think about, that when we are thinking about let us say any kind of idea of reportage or information, which the media's job is, how do you maintain any kind of distance or neutrality in those contexts? Is it possible to then basically have an objective idea? So, one example is that protesters at the World Trade Organization and the IMF meetings were depicted as violent and disruptive because the WTO and IMF were seen as bodies that agreed with what the US position has been, while the police violence on the protesters and provocations were minimized. So, what you also see is a clear propaganda in terms of how media depicts people who agree with the official American versions versus the ones who protest against it. So, the media, it actually ignores substantive issues and it exaggerates protester violence, suppresses the coverage of police repression and civil liberties violations. This is also something which happens across the world, where you see that the media only concentrates on reporting ideas and facts which it wants the people to know. And therefore, this takes us to this question, that if the sources themselves are compromised, can the information be neutral and objective? So, the fourth filter is titled FLAC, which means that the possibility of negative responses to media content that exist in a democratic setup. Now, here it is also important to remember that the propaganda model is being talked about in the context of democratic societies, because in non-democratic societies you do not need a propaganda model. You already have a dictatorship which has no qualms to hide or manipulate its citizens, because it is very clearly stated that it is a dictatorial state, and here the state and whoever is in power is the supreme authority. So, you do not need to create a facade of a democracy. Whereas in democracy, this propaganda model, it exists and basically operates through these filters, and FLAC is very important, that people have the illusion and the idea and also the possibility in many cases of reporting negative content. So, they can complain, they can file lawsuits, they can also pressurize the media groups as certain mechanisms to discipline the media. And what it also means is basically gives people this idea that you can raise your voice if you are unhappy with the media. At the same time, the media is also given the right to question and critically analyze the government sources, but at the same time you also have the possibility of censoring the media by discouraging basically dissent, by focusing on what negative attractions it might be, and basically it also means that the state it allows media to criticize and critically analyze its actions, but at the same time it discourages dissent by making the media a part of a society in which censorship is possible, in which it is possible to cut media's rights, it is possible to insult journalists and reporters who may be asking critical questions, etc. So, what you have is also a FLAC as a filter which operates at multiple levels. One is that it basically maintains an illusion among citizens that you are able to express your dissent with content that is being shown in the media, because it is a democratic society, and also at another level where the media is allowed to express FLAC and discontentment with what certain civil societies, government organizations, etc. are doing. But at the same time, very importantly, the state also has mechanisms to curb and control this FLAC. So, essentially then it operates as a filter. The last filter is ideology, and this filter is what Herman and Chomsky calls rooted in originally the anti-communist ideology, which has a context of the Cold War. Now, many of you will already be familiar with the fact that the US and the USSR were two blocs who did not see eye to eye, and this has been called the Cold War. That battle, although it was hard power oriented and geographical, also reflected an ideological battle, where the battle was for broader ideological control, and communism represented the USSR bloc, whereas the ideology of laissez-faire, market economy, free market, etc., represented what would be the US bloc. And therefore, the US media, it had an anti-communist rhetoric which it used to shape public perception and consent, and this is how the manufacturing of news and consent was done. So, for instance, in the Vietnam War, it was not only a war about people and hard power, but also about ideologies, and for the longest time there was control on how the Vietnam War was a war against communism, and many Americans have later gone on to say in many documentaries as well as their memoirs that they were fed wrong information about the Vietnam War, about how they were winning and how that communism was a bad thing, etc. Ideally rooted in how ideology itself is used as a filter in creating news. And when there were protests against the Vietnam War and US's continued investment of huge funds in that war, there were several protests which were also sidelined in the media. So, you have that a propaganda model is operating, and it is operating in these multiple ways through these filters. Now, what you also see is some arguing that the internet and the new communication technologies are breaking the corporate stranglehold on journalism and opening an unprecedented era of interactive democratic media. Now, this is something that we had discussed in the third unit, that how digital media is opening up the democracy. And it is true and important that the internet has increased the efficiency and scope of individual and group networking, which has enabled people to escape mainstream media's constraints in many diverse cases. This is true, this is something which both scholars acknowledge. However, although the internet has been a valuable addition to what would be the communicative sphere, it has limitations as well, and those whose information needs are most acute are not well served by the internet. Many lack access, its databases are not designed to meet their needs, and the use of databases presupposes knowledge and organization. So, you can see that there is also a critique of the digital or the internet, that it is also rooted in the same structural constraints within which mainstream media operate. The internet is not an instrument of mass communication for those lacking the brand names and already existing large audience and or large resources. So, the idea is that the internet also does not function well if the structural infrastructures are not there. That the new technologies are mainly introduced to meet corporate needs, as has been argued, and those of recent years have permitted media firms to shrink staff even as they achieve greater outputs, and they have made possible global distribution systems which reduce the number of media entities. Now, media houses have used the internet as an excuse to bring in another layer of exclusion by firing staff, reducing the number of people, and also a constant work culture where there is almost no breaks, etc. The competition for advertising in fact has become very intense, and the boundaries between the editorial and the advertising departments have weakened. And what you see is that newsrooms becoming very incorporated into transnational corporate empires. So, therefore, newsrooms have become very heavy pressure duty kind of spaces where it is very charged, and how it operates in the newsroom is that the news which is created, it has to become viral. So, the force of anti-communist ideology has probably weakened especially with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the virtual disappearance of what you see or know as socialist movements across the globe. But this is also easily offset by the greater ideological force of a belief in the miracle of the market. So, this is how people would like to think, and more people think, and the triumph of capitalism and the increasing power of those with an interest in privatization and market rule, they have actually strengthened the market ideology, and we have been talking about this throughout the course as we see the evolution of market forces. Advertisers don't like the public sphere where audiences are small, and they also don't like controversies which could be upsetting, and basically these settings are not ideal for selling goods. Their preference for entertainment underlie the gradual erosion of the public sphere, and also how we think about commercial media has changed. Media industries have become very centralized, and especially in the US context, how there has been also an Americanization of media, and we had been discussing this earlier as well, that when we look at OTT platforms, also a major form of communication today, it is very US dominated. And what Herman and Chomsky say is that 9 transnational conglomerates control most major outlets. So, this is a very different level of concentration. Ownership and control influence content with a key focus on entertainment and profit, and independent journalism requires a lot of work to be sustained. Media firms have expanded globally. Media is a lucrative business, and it is driven by this neoliberal idea. You have mergers, you have technological advances, and major corporations today dominate the news market and the newsroom, which is also something very antithetical to how the democratic public sphere would be seen. So, what we then see is a very different kind of explanation and an analysis of how the media works at the inner levels. Now, while this book was written in 1988, we did not see a lot of what was happening in the digital sphere, but the 2 authors go on to basically also edit the book in its subsequent editions and revise its introduction, where they deliberate on the role of the internet in the public sphere. And that is also something which makes us understand this working of the propaganda model much better, because you have a comprehensive understanding of how it operates in the inner ways in which media brings us what would be considered news. Now, this is the beginning of this unit, and I will be following it up with subsequent lectures on how processes, formations, identities and representations are important to the media process. Thank you very much.